Hey, so tonight we'll drift into a soft and ancient corner of Greek mythology, one that rarely makes it into the loud halls of thunderbolts and drama. This is a story not about war or wild romance, but about a goddess, a flute, and the kind of boredom only immortals can afford. So dim your lights, settle under your blanket, and let your thoughts slow down like honey dripping from a warm spoon. If this calm journey helps you unwind, feel free to tap like and subscribe. Only if it feels right, of course. Now close your eyes and let's begin. Let me tell you something quiet. Not everything in Olympus was about lightning and passion. Sometimes it was about a whistle. You see, Athena, yes, that Athena, the armoured goddess of wisdom, once got curious about sound. Not the clang of shield and spear, no. She was curious about that thin, reedy hum the wind makes when it slips through a cracked temple window. You've heard it, haven't you? That soft sigh like marble breathing. That's where this begins. It was some time after the invention of olives, but before democracy had picked up steam, around 600 BCE if we're being generous with the mythic timeline. Athena had already gifted Athens its namesake tree, that gnarled olive with roots deep enough to reach sleepy underworld dreams. The city adored her. Statues were polished, prayers whispered, and every second Tuesday some poor goat was offered up with flattering compliments. But praise is funny. It never fills the quiet hours. And one late afternoon, in a breeze-soaked alcove of the Acropolis, Athena grew curious. There had been a feast. Lots of figs, some very dry barley cakes, and a pomegranate that refused to open politely. The gods had argued about poetry versus prophecy again. Apollo had tried to show off with his lyre again. And Dionysus, well, he'd turned the grape juice into something far less responsible. Athena had excused herself early, robes rustling like parchment, and wandered alone. That's when she heard it. That thin, breathy whistle between the reeds. Not quite a bird, not quite wind, something else. Something waiting. So, what does a goddess do when she hears a new sound? She decides to improve it, of course. Now, crafting an instrument when you're divine is both easy and absurd. There's no need for tools, just an idea and a bit of celestial stubbornness. She took 2 hollow bones from a deer, don't worry, it had died of natural boredom, and polished them with the corner of her cloak. Then she bored tiny holes, no bigger than a grain of millet, and aligned them with an elegance only a goddess of geometry could manage. She lifted it to her lips and blew. The first note was awful. Imagine a goose sneezing inside a clay jar. That was the sound. The second note was worse. It startled a pigeon so severely it laid an egg 2 weeks early. But by the third note, something changed. There was a resonance, a warble, like a sleepy spring bubbling beneath stone. Her owl, always half asleep, perked up and blinked twice. That was rare. So she played on. Each note a question, each pause a comma of thought. The sky didn't split, the earth didn't shake, but somewhere far below the marble steps, an old man paused in his sweeping and muttered, "Ha!" Now, flutes, especially divine flutes, are tricky. Unlike lyres or drums, they require breath. And while gods didn't breathe the way mortals did, they could mimic the art. So Athena practiced. Morning, afternoon, even once during a very long council meeting when no one noticed she'd snuck in a few scales behind her helmet. And the thing is, she got good. Surprisingly good. She discovered that certain notes made leaves shiver, even on windless days. One soft trill made bakers forget they'd left bread in the oven. This led to several crispy loaves and one minor shrine to the goddess of burnt crust. Another tune sent fish jumping along the riverbanks in what might have been applause. She was proud. Proud enough to try it out properly. Small concert. A solo performance. Just her, a grove of oaks, and a few startled goats for an audience. She sat beneath the dappled shade and played. Now here's where it gets awkward. You remember that gods are vain, right? Even the wise ones, especially the wise ones. Athena expected admiration. Maybe a soft applause from the clouds. Perhaps a few dryads swooning or a philosopher composing an ode. Instead, she got snickers from the reeds, more precisely from the river nymphs lounging nearby. who'd watched the whole thing while pretending to braid each other's algae. They giggled, not out of cruelty, but because, even at her most divine, Athena looked, well, funny. Eyes puffed, cheeks bulging, blowing like a blacksmith's bellows, and to top it off, the flute had left 2 tiny lines across her lips, like whiskers. "Is that the newest battle tactic?" one nymph asked. "Puff them to death?" Athena, ever poised, said nothing. She stood, nodded, and floated away on a breeze that smelled faintly of time and dignity. She never played the flute again. But here's the thing, she didn't destroy it either. She left it in the woods, just propped it against a rock, and from that day on, music snuck into the world through shepherds, flutists, wandering dreamers who found reeds and wondered. The flute had been born, Athena was done. But don't worry, there's more. Because once she stopped playing, others started, and that, dear listener, is where it gets surprisingly cozy. Imagine the first mortal to find that flute, barefoot, hungry, maybe carrying a fig they weren't supposed to pick. They'd blow into it, just out of curiosity, and from it would come a note, just one, but it would hum, and they'd smile. Not a big smile, just that quiet kind that happens when something unexpected goes right. And somewhere far above, in a temple draped with ivy and owl feathers, Athena would glance down, arch a brow, and maybe, just maybe, smirk. Now, let your mind wander to the low hills of Arcadia, where a satyr once tried to recreate the flute using carrots. Let's keep drifting, shall we? Now that you're tucked in and the night has settled like a warm woolen shawl over your shoulders, let your thoughts tiptoe softly into another corner of the ancient world. We're not staying in the temple this time. We're headed into the soft hills of Arcadia, where the grass grows tall and mischief rustles through the underbrush like a half-forgotten breeze. This is where we meet a satyr named Melixos. If you've never met a satyr before, well, imagine a mischievous goat who discovered snacks and sarcasm and decided never to grow up. Melixos was particularly fond of naps, figs, and playing tricks that were only funny to him and perhaps to small children who liked watching adults fall into streams. He wasn't famous. Not like Pan, who had his own set of pipes and a cult following in the flute scene. No, Melixos was, let's say, locally appreciated. The kind of fellow who might show up uninvited to a picnic, eat half your olives, and then charm his way into a seat with a riddle that didn't quite make sense. One early morning, long before breakfast had been invented but right after the mist had begun to lift from the hills, Melixos was munching on a particularly crunchy carrot. This was not an ordinary carrot. It had grown in the shadow of a stone that vaguely resembled Apollo's nose, and that, according to local superstition, gave vegetables the ability to taste slightly more dramatic. As Melixos gnawed and wandered, he stumbled, literally, over something curious. A hollow reed. It was propped gently against a mossy rock, pale, smooth, worn at the mouthpiece by lips far more disciplined than his. He picked it up, twirled it between his fingers, and gave it a sniff. "Smells like olive oil and disappointment," he mumbled. Then, just for fun, he gave it a try. The sound that emerged wasn't quite musical. It was more inquisitive, like a frog trying to understand algebra. But something stirred in Melixos's fuzzy little heart. Not because he liked music. He didn't. He liked noise. Noise that startled birds and confused shepherds. But this had potential. He took the flute back to his den, really just a hollow tree with ambition, and decided to reverse engineer it using his own materials, which, unfortunately, consisted mostly of stolen laundry, hollow sticks, and half-eaten vegetables. Enter the carrot. It was the only thing long enough, soft enough, and available without divine consequences, so he carved it. Badly. He used his thumbnail, a seashell, and at one point, his teeth. The result looked like a flute if you squinted very hard and had recently been hit on the head with a lyre. Still, he tried it, and wouldn't you know, it made a sound. A glorious, sputtering, wheezy sound, like a sleepy goose honking underwater. Melixos was thrilled. He paraded through the meadow playing his carrot flute like a conquering hero. Birds scattered. Bees took offence. At one point, an old tortoise actually turned around in protest. Now most satyrs would have stopped there, declared victory, eaten the instrument. But Melixos had a different idea. He started a band. That's right, he recruited a hedgehog for percussion using acorns in a gourd, a crow for rhythm, mostly squawking in time, and a badger who just liked to hum. Together, they were terrible, but gloriously so. Their music echoed down the valleys, confusing traders, annoying dryads, and once causing an entire sheep herd to walk backwards for a full hour. But it caught on. Soon, other satyrs wanted in. One carved a flute from a turnip, another tried using a zucchini. They didn't sound good, but they were loud, and in the hills of Arcadia, that was half the battle. Word spread. One day, a wandering shepherd stumbled across their performance. His name was Daphneon, and he had recently been dumped by a wood nymph named Leela, who preferred trees that didn't talk back. Daphneon sat down to listen, tears drying on his cheeks. He didn't expect to find comfort in the wail of root vegetables, but something about the honesty of that out-of-tune carrot moved him. It wasn't polished, it wasn't graceful, but it was real. He clapped, slowly, then asked for lessons, and that's how the vegetable flute school began. Now, I know what you're thinking. Surely this was a fad, a seasonal novelty, something forgotten like all the other oddities in Greek myth. But not quite. You see, years later, when a certain Roman named Apicius wrote about boiled parsnip preserves and fig compotes, he also briefly mentioned a strange melody played by a band of half-goat men with winded tubers. Scholars dismissed it as metaphor, but we know better. Some say Melixos eventually retired and became a gardener, that he grew an entire field of musical produce, each root with its own tone, each leaf whispering in harmony with the wind. Others say he tried to patent the idea but was laughed out of Olympus by Hermes, who'd already trademarked panpipes and related blowing mechanisms. But no matter which version you believe, the point is this. Creativity, even when silly, sticks. Sometimes the best instruments are born not of marble and wisdom, but of curiosity and snacks. And as the sun set on those golden Arcadian hills, and the last breath wheezed through a celery stalk somewhere near the sheep pens, you might have heard a tune, off-key, oddly charming, and entirely original. So, if you ever find yourself holding a hollow carrot at dusk, maybe give it a try. Now, drift with me across the slope of time to a little marketplace by the Aegean, where one merchant tried to sell cheese by serenading customers with a nose flute made of olive pits. Let your thoughts stay light, like warm bread steam or the scent of honeyed almonds carried on a lazy summer breeze. Tonight, we leave the quiet Arcadian glades and float over to an island market, bustling but never rushed, where the waves hum lullabies against the stones, and even the fish seem to drowse in nets, unwilling to flap too much. We're in Cirrus now, a modest Aegean island with just enough sunshine to warm the top of your head and just enough shade to tempt naps after lunch. That kind of place. You know the kind. The streets are made of smooth white stones, not fancy marble, just very well walked. The buildings lean inward like neighbours whispering gossip across laundry lines. And in the middle of the marketplace, wedged between the fig seller and a man who exclusively sells woven goat hair socks, stands a cheese merchant named Agitor. Now, Agitor was not your average dairyman. His cheeses were fine, not spectacular, not dreadful. Middle of the road in flavour, leaning mildly toward foot. But what made Agitor memorable wasn't the cheese, it was the music. You see, Agitor believed, quite passionately, that sound sold snacks. He'd read somewhere, perhaps scrawled on a tavern wall by someone pretending to be a philosopher, that the ears must be wooed before the tongue can taste. It stuck in his head like a burr in a sandal, so he invented what he humbly called the world's first nose flute made from olive pits. Yes, olive pits. He claimed inspiration struck while snacking and sneezing at the same time, which if you've ever eaten too many salted olives too quickly, you'll know is a very plausible chain of events. He took a plump Kalamata pit, cleaned, dried, and very lovingly polished with a lamb's wool sock, and bored a tiny hole straight through the middle using a heated bronze skewer. One breath through the nostrils, and there it was. A high, reedy peep like a baby goat trying to sing opera from inside a jar. Now here's where it gets interesting. Agitor didn't keep this talent to himself. Oh no, he incorporated it into every sale. Woman asks for 2 wheels of aged goat cheese. She gets a song with them, a sharp, zigzagging tune that sounds vaguely like "Oh Cheese of Mine," if played by someone balancing upside down on a barrel. A boy steals a corner of feta. He gets chased not with a broom, but with an aggressive solo in B-flat nasal. And during festival weeks, Agitor organised full-blown olive pit recitals, accompanied by tambourines and the occasional confused rooster. People came for the novelty. Tourists from Naxos would pretend not to be impressed, then ask for an encore. Children would bring him the pits from their parents' olives, just to see if he could make them sing too. Sometimes he could. Sometimes they exploded in his face. But that was part of the charm. One summer during the festival of soft cheeses and short poems, a real event, I promise, celebrated mostly with quiet enthusiasm and extremely buttery crackers, Agitor unveiled his masterpiece, a double-nostril flute. 2 olive pits joined with wax and twine played simultaneously. The sound? Unforgettable. Imagine a sleepy cicada performing a duet with a squeaky door hinge. Add a rhythm that sounded vaguely like someone hopping on one leg. Now imagine hearing that as you sampled soft white cheese drizzled with thyme-infused honey. A little strange? Yes. But oddly, relaxing. Some say the double nose-pit flute had calming powers, that bakers nearby had fewer arguments, that pigeons stopped fighting over crumbs. One woman claimed her baby fell asleep in record time during one of Agitor's slower pieces, though she did admit it might have also been the warm milk. There was, of course, the occasional critic. Hermes, always the prankster, once stopped by in disguise and challenged Agitor to a duel, nose flute versus lyre. The crowd gathered, bread was dunked, bets were placed, and in the end Hermes let the cheeseman win, declaring, "Even gods need a snack serenade sometimes." Agitor didn't let it go to his head. He just added a little sign to his stall, "Preferred by Olympians, possibly." And as the years rolled by, his olive pit flutes gained a kind of quiet fame. Not immortal legend, not poetic epics, but whispered memories. Stories passed between bites of bread and sips of wine. The kind of tale grandparents tell their grandkids at dusk, when everything smells faintly of lemons and the cicadas start humming. If you ever find yourself on Syros, look for the little stone niche by the olive press. There's a dusty little plaque, barely readable but still clinging to time. It says, "Agitor, inventor of the nose flute. May your cheeses be melodic and your sneezes well-timed." And sometimes, just as the sun slips into the sea, you might hear the soft, uncertain peep of a reedless tune drifting down the cobbled lanes. Now, roll over gently, let your blanket swaddle you tighter, and float with me to the slopes of Mount Pelion, where an old centaur once tried to teach harp to hedgehogs, and ended up creating the world's most stubborn lullaby. Now, let's keep wandering, softly, slowly, into another pocket of the ancient world. We've had reeds and roots and olive pits, and now it's time for strings. Not elegant lyre strings plucked under moonlight by tragic heroes. No, we're headed to a quieter hill somewhere halfway up Mount Pelion, where an old centaur named Pyros once made the very odd decision to teach harp to hedgehogs. Why? Well, why not? Mount Pelion wasn't all drama and destiny. For every Chiron tutoring noble warriors in healing and honour, there were 10 other centaurs like Pyros who'd retired from all that and just wanted to garden. Pyros was old. Not immortal, but persistent. He had a beard like unravelling yarn, eyes like mossy stones, and a fondness for fermented apple drink that probably explained a lot of his choices. One spring morning, as dew glistened like spilled pearl dust and the birds tuned their beaks for chorus, Pyros sat outside his cottage with a battered little harp. It had just 7 strings, 3 tight, 2 slack, and 2 that buzzed like bees with seasonal allergies. He played slowly, carefully. The tune wasn't beautiful exactly, but it was sincere, like a lullaby hummed by someone who'd forgotten the words but remembered the feeling. And that's when he noticed. He had an audience. 3 hedgehogs, tiny, round, and still drowsy from winter, blinking at him from beneath the thyme bush. One yawned, one sniffled. One, perhaps the boldest, shuffled closer with a look that said, "Go on, old man." So Pyros did. He played until the breeze forgot to move, until the shadows curled up to listen, And then, on a whim, he set the harp down and said, "You lot want a turn?" Now, teaching hedgehogs music is not something covered in epic scrolls or golden plaques, but Pyrrhos had time and patience and a basket full of plum slices he was willing to use as motivation. The first few weeks were experimental. The hedgehogs mostly sat on the strings or licked the wood. One fell asleep directly inside the harp's curve, but over time they began to respond, tapping, nudging. One learned to strum by rolling gently forward with just the right pressure. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even particularly pleasant, but it was rhythm. Honest, thumpy, pokey rhythm. Pyrrhos was delighted. He named them. Of course he did. Snuffle, Pebble, and Lady Pickles. They became his ensemble. Most days they played under the laurel tree. The harp played flat so the hedgehogs could bounce, scoot, and occasionally nap mid-performance. Pyrrhos added little bells, a dried gourd shaker. Once a squirrel joined in with a walnut drum. The music that resulted was peculiar. Imagine the sound of dreams when you've had too much honey and fallen asleep in a bean sack. One travelling poet lost on the slope stumbled across a performance and declared it the most confusingly peaceful moment of my life. He stayed for 3 days, ate all of Pyrrhos's olives, and left without shoes but full of oddly specific metaphors. News spread as it always does, though never too quickly when hedgehogs are involved. People began to visit. Not crowds, this was Mount Pelion after all, not Delphi. But enough. They brought gifts, dried fruit, new strings, a tiny crown of woven reeds for Lady Pickles, who wore it once and then promptly sat on it. One afternoon, during the Festival of Almost Spring, a local holiday that mostly involved sniffing wildflowers and nodding at bees, Pyrrhos and the hedgehogs were asked to perform for a very particular guest. Apollo, yes, that Apollo. Golden, glowing, and mildly annoyed that someone had dared combine music and rodents without asking him first. He arrived on a sunbeam, sandals glinting and hair that looked freshly combed by 3 minor deities with high standards. Pyrrhos bowed, the hedgehogs did not. One sneezed. Apollo, curious despite himself, said, "Show me," and they did. A soft, slightly out-of-time lullaby full of pauses, hesitations, and one unexpected hiccup that somehow tied it all together. It wasn't grand, it didn't soar, but it was soothing in a way that made Apollo's shoulders drop 1/2 inch. When it ended, he simply said, then handed Pyrrhos a fig and left. Pyrrhos considered that high praise. The harp ensemble continued for many years. The hedgehogs aged, as all do, and their children learned too. The music shifted, slowed, became more ambient. By the time Pyrrhos's beard reached his knees, he no longer performed for audiences, just himself, and maybe a passing butterfly or two. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind rustles through Pelion's thyme bushes and the moonlight lingers in soft pools, you might hear it. A faint thrum, like little feet pattering across strings, like dreams plucking the edges of sleep. And so we tiptoe onward, down the other side of the hill, to a sleepy coastal inn where an inventor tried to bottle sea air in clay jugs and accidentally created the first wind chime meant entirely for naps. And now we sail gently, rocking side to side like a bobbing cork, toward a quiet little inn tucked into the crook of a coastline that hasn't rushed in centuries. Let the air grow salty in your imagination. Let your skin tingle with the memory of sun-warmed pebbles. We've arrived at a place that smelled of rosemary, wood smoke, and, oddly enough, old amphorae that had been turned into wind chimes. This was the Inn of the Soft Wave. Not a grand name, not a famous one. But if you asked the fishermen from the surrounding coves where they slept best after long nights casting nets into moonlight, they'd point here. Always here. The bedding was lumpy, the soup a little thin, but the air was magic. And it all started with a man named Thalos. Thalos was an inventor, though he never called himself that. He preferred jar thinker or enthusiastic pot fiddler. He'd once tried to build a staircase that played notes when you stepped on it, but the goats kept dancing on it and making dinner impossible. He retired to the coast and took a job sweeping floors at the Inn of the Soft Wave. But his mind, it never stopped tinkering. One breezy afternoon, while scrubbing fish guts from a basket handle, Thalos paused. The sea wind had come curling through the courtyard, swirling around a stack of empty clay jugs left outside to dry. As it passed through their narrow mouths, the jugs hummed, just softly, like the ocean singing to itself about something only waves understand. Thalos stood still, gooseflesh prickling, and whispered to the breeze, "Do that again." It didn't, of course, but Thalos was hooked. That night he took 6 jugs and tied them together with a fraying rope. He placed them beneath the wooden eaves outside his small room and waited. The wind came just before dawn, and the jars sang again. It wasn't music in the way Apollo would like. It was ambient, wandering, a whisper that wound around your thoughts and tugged them gently towards sleep. One jar made a low tone like a snoring cat. Another moaned like someone reading poetry into a cave. Guests began to ask, "What's that sound at night?" Not in complaint, but curiosity, and Thalos would smile with that squinty, sleep-deprived grin of a man who has absolutely no idea how it's working, but is thrilled that it is. Soon, he refined the design. He experimented with jug sizes, shapes, even thickness. Thick clay gave a deeper tone. Thin clay made a breathier whistle. He added holes, strings, small weights made from driftwood. Each version was slightly better, or at least differently strange. By the festival of tired fishermen, celebrated mostly by dozing in boats tied to docks, Thalos had constructed what he called the sea breeze trap, a chandelier of clay mouths and suspended reeds that responded to even the faintest gust. He hung it above the inn's main table, and when the windows were open just enough, it filled the dining hall with sound. Not chatter, not song, just comfort, like the sound a seashell makes when pressed to your ear, only closer, softer, like the sea was whispering, "Just rest, the tide can wait." Patrons returned. Not for the food, it was still average. Not for the beds, they creaked like skeptical philosophers, but for the sleep. Word reached the mainland. A philosopher from Corinth arrived to study the phenomenon. He theorized that the particular frequency of the jars aligned with the vibrations of restful thought. He wrote a long scroll called On the Sonic Qualities of Porous Ceramics and the Subtle Winds, which no one read past page 3. Thalos didn't mind, just made more chimes. Soon, every corner of the inn had its own sound. The upper rooms had chimes tuned to twilight, the lower ones to dawn. The room beside the kitchen had one tuned to cancel out the sounds of snoring, which unfortunately made guests dream of buzzing bees instead. One guest, a wandering healer named Athena, claimed she hadn't slept so well since the Oracle of Dodona whispered lullabies into olive leaves. She left him a sprig of laurel and a blessing written on a strip of cloth soaked in chamomile tea. Thalos tied it to one of the jars. It added a soft flapping sound like a moth thinking about decisions. Years later, when the inn passed to a new owner, they tried removing the jars. Sales plummeted. Patrons grew twitchy. One man said he couldn't find his dreams without the sea jar whisperers, so they were rehung and have remained ever since. If you visit today, and you mustn't hurry when you do, you'll find the wind still slipping through those clay vessels. You'll hear tones too gentle to name, too shy to record. But if you close your eyes and listen, really listen, you might feel your thoughts settle like silt in still water. And perhaps you'll remember that not all music is made for dancing. Some is made for sleeping, for drifting, for returning to the sea, not with splashes, but sighs. So let's leave the inn now, soft-footed and full of warm barley tea. Come with me up the hill where an elderly potter once discovered that shaping dough to ancient rhythms helped her bake the fluffiest bread in Thebes. We've wandered far, but not hurried. That's the beauty of nights like this, when the sky hums low and even the stars seem to sigh between glimmers. Now let's meander back inland to Thebes, where the air smells faintly of warm grain and dust, and where an old woman once kneaded history into her bread. Her name was Eliska, and she was a potter by trade, but a baker by temperament. You know the type. Hands always dusted with flour whether or not she's been baking, a face full of creases, most of which came from smiling, and an apron so worn it told its own epic. Eliska had lived many lives, figuratively and almost literally. She'd made amphorae for soldiers, vases for lovers, bowls for funerals, and once a series of comically small jars for a poet who believed that miniaturizing sadness made it easier to swallow. But by the time we find her, Eliska had long since retired from shaping clay. Her fingers, once nimble and precise, were slower now, stiffer, so she turned them to something warmer. Bread. Now, bread in Thebes wasn't new. People had been baking for generations, but Eliska, she believed in rhythm. You see, years ago, before her joints had started whispering, Eliska had spent a season in Delphi helping repair cracked pots near the temple. During one lazy afternoon, she'd heard a priestess humming while sorting laurel leaves. The tune was ancient, older than syllables, something in between heartbeat and lullaby. It nestled into Eliska's memory like a pebble finding the perfect spot in a stream. She never forgot it. Years later, standing in her humble kitchen in the back alleys of Thebes, she found herself humming that same rhythm while kneading dough. And something odd happened. The bread rose differently. Not faster, not slower, but better. Airier, more cooperative. Less like a lump of wet clay and more like a sleeping cloud that had just learned to breathe. She tested it again the next morning. Same flour, same water, same salt. But this time, no humming. The dough fought back, sticky, sulky, refused to shape properly. It slumped resentful, like a bored dog. So she hummed again, and there it was, that smooth pliability, that easy stretch, like the dough had remembered how to be part of something bigger. From then on, Eliska always hummed while baking, always the same ancient rhythm. 3 soft beats, then 1 longer pull, like breathing out a sigh and catching it again on the return. She never wrote it down, never taught it. But she didn't need to, because people could taste it. Travellers passing through Thebes would find their way to her tiny stall tucked between a fig vendor and a man who sold fish jokes for spare coins. The bread didn't look special, round, brown, with flour-dusted tops and the occasional dimple where Eliska's thumb had pressed too fondly. But it smelled like warmth, like lullabies, like nap-after-lunch dreams. A stonemason once declared, mouth half full, "This loaf tastes like what my mother meant when she said, 'Just rest a minute.'" Eliska smiled, nodded, and gave him a second one for free. She became something of a legend. Not a loud one. Not the sort sung by bards. Just a name passed between midwives and shepherds. Go to the old woman on Loaf Alley, the one who sings bread into being. Now, not everyone believed the rhythm mattered. One clever merchant tried to copy her technique, watched her carefully, memorized her movements, even recorded the rhythm by tapping it out on his knees like an overeager beetle. But when he baked, his loaves tasted fine, edible, but not cozy. He returned to her stall frustrated. Eliska handed him a warm roll and said softly, "It's not the rhythm in your ears, it's the one in your chest." He didn't quite understand, but he ate the roll and didn't complain. And so it went. For years, Eliska baked. She hummed, and people slept better after eating her bread. Not because it was magical, not because it was enchanted, but because it was attuned to time, to touch, to something older than technique and yeast. When she passed away peacefully, with her apron still dusted in flour, they say the pigeons in Thebes cooed in harmony for 3 days. Her oven was left untouched, its coals slowly cooling like a final exhale. But if you walk those alleys today, especially near dusk when the sunlight hits the clay walls just right, you might hear a low hum carried by the wind. You might find yourself stepping to its beat, your own breath catching the rhythm. And if you find a bakery, anywhere, not just in Thebes, where the bread tastes like comfort and naps and stories told through fingertips, well, maybe Eliska taught them, in a way. Now tuck that tail like a napkin under your chin and follow me through a lazy olive grove, where a forgetful satrap tried to compose lullabies for chickens and ended up inventing the earliest known feathered lullaby choir. Let your thoughts nestle like warm eggs in a straw basket, and follow me now into a grove that smells of sun-warmed olives and freshly upturned dirt. The trees here are old, older than names, older even than boundaries, and they twist skyward as if stretching after a nap that lasted through 5 generations of shepherds. We're visiting a small villa on the edge of what was once Lydia, or maybe Phrygia, depending on who was in charge that week. But none of that mattered to the man who lived there, a retired satrap named Ophis, who spent most of his days trying to remember why he had ever worked in politics. Ophis was not a bad satrap, nor a particularly good one. He had the memory of a leaky amphora and the attention span of a squirrel tasting wine for the first time. He forgot meetings, misplaced decrees, and once attempted to mint coins with his own face but forgot to tell anyone which side was heads. Eventually his advisors suggested, very gently, that he might enjoy managing affairs of a more pastoral nature. So he retired to the olive grove with a small staff, 17 chickens, and the vague hope of becoming a poet, or a beekeeper, or perhaps something involving cushions. But poetry is tricky when your metaphors wander off mid-thought, and beekeeping requires a kind of alertness that Ophis only possessed between naps, so he focused on the chickens. Now, these weren't ordinary chickens, not by divine lineage or special markings, but by temperament. They were insomniacs. Every night, without fail, they clucked, squabbled, and flapped. One in particular, named Marble because she had the emotional stability of a misplaced sculpture, would spend hours pacing in her coop, muttering to herself like an old philosopher rehearsing grievances. Ophis tried everything. He offered them warm mash, read them excerpts from scrolls on grain distribution, which had always put him to sleep. Even hired a lyre player from the next village who, upon hearing the audience, refused to perform out of respect for his professional standards. And then one dusk, as shadows stretched long and olive leaves fluttered like drowsy eyelids, Ophis did something unexpected. He hummed. Just a little melody, not even a real song, more like the memory of a lullaby his mother might have sung, back before cities and coinage and all those meetings he only pretended to attend. The effect was immediate. 2 chickens blinked, one sat down. Marble paused mid-rant and tilted her head. Encouraged, Ophis repeated the tune, this time with a little rhythm, patting gently on a wooden bucket. The notes were slow, round, and remarkably soothing for something that came from a man wearing one sock and a toga that hadn't been washed since Apollo's birthday. The chickens settled, every last one of them. From that day forward, Ophis committed himself to composing lullabies. Not for humans. He claimed human minds were too cluttered with ambitions and worries. Chickens, he insisted, understood the purity of rest. He tested melodies each evening, refining tones that matched the arc of the setting sun. He once crafted an entire sonata using only clucks and foot taps. His most famous piece, Soft Dust Beneath the Roost, became a local legend, not because anyone else heard it, but because every chicken within 5 miles started sleeping through the night. Farmers noticed, egg production rose, tempers softened. One woman swore her rooster stopped waking her at dawn and instead waited politely until breakfast was ready. Scholars arrived. One argued that Ophis had accidentally discovered the avian theta frequency, whatever that meant. Another theorized that the songs echoed primordial rhythms of the earth itself, and promptly fell asleep under a fig tree before finishing his theory. But Ophis didn't care for theories. He just liked watching his chickens sleep. He built them hammocks, not practical ones, more like nets of moss and twine hung between coop posts. He even carved tiny pillows from soft pine and embroidered them with symbols he claimed were ancient lullaby runes. They weren't. They were doodles, but they worked. Eventually Ophis wrote a scroll of Feathers and Rest, the art of the chicken lullaby. It was ignored by historians, but became unexpectedly popular among basket weavers, who claimed it made excellent wrapping paper. He lived a long, peaceful life, and when he passed, the chickens mourned quietly. Marble paced in silence. The staff laid him to rest beneath the oldest olive tree. They say that each dusk, for several years after, the breeze carried a faint melody, 3 hums and a pause, rising from the grove like the soft coo of a memory. Now, if you ever find yourself near a chicken coop on a sleepless night, try humming something. Anything simple, anything kind. You might find the chickens understand, and maybe, just maybe, you'll sleep better too. Now let your mind meander like a slow stream through a meadow, where a sleepy shepherd once discovered that chewing certain reeds made him dream of symphonies, even though he couldn't carry a tune if it came with a handle. Let's keep ambling, friend, like a sheep that has wandered just far enough from the flock to feel the thrill of independence, but not so far as to miss supper. Come with me through a meadow that sighs with late summer warmth, where the breeze is drowsy and the grass hums gently in place. Here we find Dorian, a shepherd with a face like a sun-dried fig and the energy of a loaf of bread after a long day. He wasn't lazy, not exactly. He just operated on what he liked to call goat time, which meant he believed everything in life could wait until after a nap, a stretch, or perhaps a daydream or three. Dorian's flock was small but well-behaved, largely because he sang to them, not beautifully, not even in key, but with the same sleepy dedication one might give to brushing a donkey's tail, thorough, patient, and completely off rhythm. Now, it happened one afternoon that Dorian, too full of honey cakes and too sleepy to walk, plopped himself into a patch of tall grass near the stream. The air was thick with the scent of wild mint and sheep musk. Bees looped lazily overhead. Somewhere a frog was having a very passionate argument with a puddle, and then Dorian bit down on a reed. Not on purpose. He was trying to chew a piece of grass and missed. But this reed, this odd, hollow, pale green stalk, let out a tone when his teeth pressed down. A low hum. Not sharp, not squeaky, but soft, round, like the kind of note a cloud would make if it ever got into music. Dorian blinked. He chewed again. Another note. Before long, he was bobbing his head, cheeks puffed, chewing in rhythm. The notes weren't beautiful. They weren't even particularly melodic. But they had a pattern, a sway, a kind of musical shuffle that bypassed his brain and nestled directly into the part of his soul that stored lullabies, warm blankets, and memories of being rocked by someone who smelled like baked apples. And then he fell asleep. Right there. Cheeks puffed, reed wedged in his molars, a smile creeping up the side of his face. His sheep sensing a certain sacredness in the moment, all lay down too. The entire flock napped, birds quieted, even the breeze slowed, so as not to disturb whatever strange symphony was echoing in Dorian's dreams. When he woke, he felt as though he'd been kissed by the entire sky. Refreshed, glowing, confused. He plucked more of the reeds, took them home, tried chewing again before bed. Same result, dreams that felt like floating through soft drums and harp strings made of rain. He tried sleeping without them one night, tossed, turned, dreamt only of loud fish and forgotten tax scrolls. So he shared his discovery, first with his cousin, who was skeptical until she chewed a reed and immediately dreamed of being serenaded by a choir of smiling figs, then with a neighbour who had been plagued by nightmares about overly judgmental roosters. He slept through the crowing for the first time in years. Soon, Dorian had a reputation. People came from nearby villages asking for those sleepy music reeds. He didn't sell them, he gave them away, but only after a demonstration. Eventually, a visiting scholar heard of the phenomenon. He brought instruments, scrolls, a tuning fork he claimed had once belonged to a muse. He tried to measure the notes, record the frequencies, analyze the dreams. But every time he chewed, he just fell asleep mid-analysis. His scrolls were later discovered in the grass, covered in drool and tiny doodles of sheep holding lyres. No one ever figured out exactly why those reeds worked. Some said they absorbed dreams and played them back. Others believed the reeds grew where the river nymphs sang lullabies into the earth long ago. One old farmer insisted it was just because chewing makes your face tired. But Dorian, he didn't need an explanation. He just kept chewing. He moved slower than ever, spoke less than before, and began composing his own reed sonatas using different-sized stalks. He claimed each length and thickness produced a distinct emotional note. One was perfect for dreaming of warm kitchens, another summoned visions of floating down streams on a bed of moss. A travelling baker once dreamed an entire new recipe after chewing a reed near Dorian's favourite nap rock, barley honey pockets stuffed with date and thyme. He said the dream told him the precise oven temperature. It became a village favourite and was later served during nap festivals. Dorian never wrote down his methods, but even today in that same meadow, if the grass is high and the wind slow, you might find a patch of reeds that hum when touched, and if you listen closely and choose softly, perhaps you too will drift into a sleep scored by the softest, cheekiest music never heard by waking ears. Now, let's leave the meadow before the bees decide we look like flowers and follow the lazy river downstream, where a bored fisherman once strung together snail shells to pass the time and wound up inventing the first underwater xylophone. Let's drift gently now, like a fallen feather on a lazy river, toward a bend where time seems to get stuck on purpose. The kind of bend where the reeds lean inward, like sleepy eavesdroppers, and the fish surface now and then, not for food but for gossip. This is where we meet Telamon, a fisherman by label, though if you asked his neighbours, they might say he was more of a dock napper who occasionally held a net. Telamon was tall, gangly, and always wore the same wide-brimmed hat that sagged over one eye like a sleepy owl. He claimed it helped him communicate better with trout. No one believed that, but it was easier than asking what he actually did all day. Each morning Telamon would row his little wooden boat out to the centre of the bend, drop his net without ceremony, and lean back against the mast with a sigh that could unravel knots. He never rushed. Fish came to him out of curiosity, or perhaps because he hummed so softly that even the minnows felt invited. One particularly slow day, slower than slow, the kind of day where even the clouds refused to move, Telamon found himself fiddling with a line of snail shells he'd pulled up with a clump of riverweed. There were 8 of them, small, smooth and empty. Not polished, not special, just river snails that had once dreamed of algae and now sat in a palm like curled commas. Telamon strung them together using bits of fishing twine. No plan, just passing time. And then, because boredom has a way of stirring invention, he tapped one with the edge of a reed. Plonk. It was a faint sound, like the note a pebble might make if it hiccuped. But it echoed oddly under the water, so he tapped another, then another. Each shell made a different sound depending on its size, its thickness, and the angle of the tap. A pattern formed, then a rhythm, and just like that, Telamon was composing. He didn't call it that, of course. He just thought of it as messing about with shell tones. But to the passing ducks, to the fish below, to the occasional startled frog, it was music. Not loud, not proud, just there. He tied the string of snail shells to a branch that dipped low into the river. When the current moved gently, the shells tapped against one another in lazy succession. If you sat in the boat with your eyes closed, you'd hear it. A soft tinkle, like someone drumming fingers on wet glass. And it worked like magic. Fish gathered. Not in panic, but in curiosity. They hovered beneath the surface, lulled into stillness by the watery lullaby. Telamon lowered his net, not to catch, but to count. He started naming them. "You're Artemon. You're Plinkus. You look like a Thalea." The fish seemed flattered. Soon he had a full set of shell instruments, some tied to branches, others hung from his oarlock, one even glued carefully to the hull of his boat with river sap and optimism. He invented techniques, flicking water drops for staccato, dragging reeds across the shells for longer notes. He became something of an artist. Not that he told anyone, but one morning a curious child wandered down to the riverbank and heard the sounds. She sat in the reeds, hidden, and listened for hours. When she finally told the village, Telamon's reputation changed from odd napper to shell music sage. People came to hear the tones. They brought lunch, wine, and low expectations, only to leave dazed and peaceful. One merchant claimed the music cured his hiccups. Another said it helped her forgive her brother for ruining her sandal during the last festival. A temple scribe visited and declared, "This must be the music Orpheus forgot to write down." Telamon responded by offering him a snail and a wink. Eventually, Telamon's boat became a floating concert. Not a crowded one, just 3 or 4 people at a time, lying back on woven mats, drifting in the current, eyes closed, ears open. He named the experience Snail Drift, though it never caught on. He never recorded the music. Couldn't, really. It changed with the river, with the wind. Some days the melody was crisp like frost on pottery. Other days it slurred and tumbled like a drowsy cat falling down the velvet steps. When Telamon grew old and even his hat gave up its shape, He passed his snail string collection to a young girl who had once fed him pickled onions and declared him my second favourite adult. She promised to keep the music alive. And so, even now, if you sit by a river bend with a handful of snail shells, a string and a little patience, you might hear it. A song for fish, a rhythm for naps, a melody meant not for glory but for floating. Now, leave the shells behind and follow the sound of clinking cups into a market square, where a travelling seller once invented the first edible musical instrument, a biscuit whistle so delicious that people kept eating the melody before the performance could finish. Now, let's wander, softly as ever, into the mellow murmur of a marketplace. One of those old ones where the stalls are made of fraying canvas. The air is thick with roasted chickpeas and wood smoke, and the shouting of sellers feels more like a lullaby than a commotion. We're somewhere near Corinth, but not quite Corinth. More like a village that's always just 2 hills over from somewhere more famous. This is where we find a man named Glaukos. Glaukos was a travelling vendor of uncertain origin and even less certain inventory. His cart was always full, but never the same twice. One week it might be carved spoons and pickled pears. The next, lavender pillows shaped like turtles. He sold according to dreams, he said, which meant his business model was very sleep-friendly and almost never profitable. But it was the biscuits that made him unforgettable. And not just any biscuits, these were biscuit whistles. Yes, you heard that right. It began on a long, slow afternoon when Glaukos, stuck in a thunderstorm under a leaky awning, got bored. He had flour, he had honey, he had no customers, so he started moulding little biscuits into shapes, fish, birds, a questionable goat. Then, on a whim, or perhaps guided by the gods of idle snacks, he poked a hole into one, then another. He shaped the edge just right, and before baking it, blew through it like a flute. And wouldn't you know, it whistled. Sort of. The note wasn't clear, not exactly a musical triumph, more like a puff with a melodic aspiration. But it made him laugh. So he made more. He adjusted the shape, made a curved one, a long one, a flat one that mostly just wheezed and crumbled. By the time the rain stopped, he had a tray of biscuit whistles, half of which sounded like startled pigeons and half of which tasted like burnt sesame joy. The next day he set up his stall. A small sign read, "Please try not to eat before playing." Naturally, everyone ignored it. Little boy played a shrill tune, then immediately bit off the mouthpiece. An old woman managed a proper scale before licking the crumbs off her fingertips and declaring it both a snack and an emotional journey. The demand exploded. People came from neighbouring villages, not just to buy, but to compose. A man named Theo played a love song on 3 biscuit whistles, gave them to his sweetheart, and then watched horrified as she ate them before he could propose. Children turned them into competitions. Who could hold the longest note without cracking the pastry? Who could eat the most while still maintaining melody? Even the local baker, who'd previously scoffed at Glaukos' unconventional style, requested a workshop. She wanted to make a biscuit tuber. Glaukos obliged. He expanded. Started using different flavours, cinnamon for warmth, thyme for focus, a special fennel seed dough that made your dreams taste vaguely of philosophy. He labelled the flavours by tone, honey and lemon for high notes, poppy seed for mid-range, olive oil shortbread for deep low hums. One batch even had a barley coating that made the notes echo slightly if played in a marble corridor. That recipe was later banned in one temple because the echoes caused the priest to think the gods were murmuring about soup. Of course, the main problem was durability. People kept eating their instruments. Glaukos tried coating them with a glaze that discouraged nibbling. It didn't work. He tried selling them with complimentary edible reeds to act as pre-snack distractions. Also failed. Finally, he accepted it. The joy was in the briefness, like dreams, like clouds shaped like turtles that vanish just before you can show someone else. He leaned into it. His slogan became, "Play it before you bite it." Soon, his cart was featured in several festival processions. Not officially, mind you, but because he always happened to be walking behind the musicians, selling snack whistles to anyone with a sense of whimsy. One year, during the Feast of Mild Triumphs, a celebration dedicated to small personal victories like waking up on time or finding the other sandal, Glaukos premiered his greatest invention, the biscuit panpipes, 8 tiny whistle biscuits strung together with sugared fig leather, tuned to an old folk song about sleeping in too late to go to war. The crowd was so charmed they forgot to cheer. Someone whispered, "I think I just tasted a lullaby," and that phrase stuck around. Glaucos never settled in one place. But people claimed they could tell when he'd passed through. The air would smell faintly of honey and roasted walnuts, and the pigeons in the square would be humming something suspiciously melodic. Even now, if you wander through a market and see a small cart painted with biscuit crumbs and laughter, stop by. Try a tune, take a bite, and if the note sounds just a little like your favourite memory from childhood, that's no coincidence. Now, dust the crumbs off your blanket and follow the trail of music crumbs to the hills near Delphi, where a harp made from stretched fig bark and goat whiskers once made an entire flock of sheep fall asleep standing up. Let's wander now into the dry golden hills near Delphi, where the thyme grows in crackly carpets and the stones remember every foot that's ever stepped too hard. The sun here is gentle, like a warm towel fresh from the laundry, and the wind, well, the wind is sleepy even at midday, the perfect kind of breeze for forgetting your errands and listening to nothing in particular. This is where a shepherd named Linos made history, and not the loud kind. You won't find his name in temple scrolls or painted across amphorae, but if you ask the local sheep, those descendants of woolly creatures who once snoozed through a landslide, they might tell you about the harp made from fig bark and goat whiskers. Linos was a soft-spoken man who spent most of his time quietly waiting for things to calm down. He waited for sheep to settle, for weather to shift, for inspiration to arrive. It almost never did. And that was fine, because in Linos' world nothing urgent ever happened, except naps. Naps were urgent. He'd tried music once before. Flute, lyre, even a hand drum made from an old stew pot. None of them suited him. Too sharp, too jangly, too awake. One late summer evening, while his sheep munched lazily on low scrub and a donkey snored against a tree, Linos peeled a strip of bark from a fig tree. It came away in one long ribbon, thin, pliable, almost humming under his fingers. He plucked it on a whim, a soft twang like a yawn. Interesting. He stretched it between 2 forked sticks, added more. He wasn't building a harp exactly, not at first, just fiddling. Trying to make something that wouldn't disturb the sheep but might make the hours between grazing and dusk feel less like slowly aging sandstone. After several tries, and one unfortunate incident where the sticks snapped and launched a beetle into his sandals, he had it. A crude frame strung with fig bark strips, each tightened just enough to make a slightly different sound. Some buzzed, some hummed. One sounded like an old woman sighing into a cushion. He plucked it gently. The sheep looked up. He plucked again. They blinked. One lay down, another strum, and another sheep folded her knees and tucked her head in. Linos paused, then played a little sequence low to high, slow as molasses flowing uphill, and within minutes the entire flock, 21 strong, was asleep. Not just drowsy. Gone. Snoring. One of them still chewing in her dreams. Linos stared at his fig bark harp as if it had whispered a prophecy. He spent the next few days refining it. Swapped in goat whiskers for the thinner strings. They vibrated more slowly, made a sound like wind brushing across fresh wool. He added a hollow gourd to the bass to amplify the lowest tones. Now the instrument had weight, warmth, a presence. He called it the narcolis, from the old word for nap summoner, or possibly cheese spoon. No one could quite agree on the etymology. Words spread, again, through sheep. One flock from the next valley over began migrating suspiciously closer each evening, shepherds noticed. "Why are our sheep walking to the next hill?" they asked. "Why do they return so rested?" They found Linos seated in the grass, half asleep himself, strumming his harp with fingers that moved like drifting petals. They begged for lessons. Linos offered tea. He taught them slowly, if at all. "It's not about music," he said. "It's about not music, about everything between the notes, like a quiet conversation between your hand and the wind." Some understood. Most just asked if they could borrow his goat whiskers. Eventually a local priestess heard the tales and came to investigate. She stayed for an hour, then 3, then accidentally dozed off and missed her own sermon. She later decreed the instrument likely blessed by Hypnos himself, and recommended it be played at all future temple naps. That's how Linos ended up with a commission, a special narcolis, crafted with ceremonial fig bark from a tree said to have grown from the spot where a hero once dropped a snack and decided fate could wait. The strings were woven from temple-donated goat whiskers and the tears of a very emotional oracle who wept when she first heard the melody. It was placed in the Hall of Restful Blessings, and no one could play it. Not because it was cursed, but because Linos never taught the rhythm. He didn't know how to. It wasn't something you practiced. It was something you settled into, like a chair that remembers your shape. The temple hired him as their official nap bard, a title he accepted only because it came with a blanket allowance. He played twice a week, under a skylight that filtered golden light onto the floor like spilled tea. Listeners came, lay down, forgot their lists, their worries, their sandals. Some dreamed of warm sheep singing lullabies in meadows shaped like pillows. When Linos passed away, the narcoles was placed beneath a fig tree at the edge of the hills. The wind still plucks at it sometimes, just gently, and the sheep still sleep better there. If you ever visit Delphi and notice the flocks napping a little earlier than usual, don't be alarmed. That's just the music still playing. Now, let's shuffle quietly down the hill and into a sleepy mountain village where a cobbler once invented shoes that squeaked in harmony, just so he wouldn't feel lonely on long walks through morning fog. Come now, slowly as a yawn, and let's step into a village so small it didn't even bother naming itself. It simply answered to the sound of its own quiet, firewood cracking, roosters snoring, fog dragging itself down cobblestone paths like a very slow dog in a wool coat. Up here in the mountain folds, things moved at a whisper. Even the goats tiptoed. This was home to a cobbler named Nestoros, a man of patient thumbs and a mind full of echo. Not thoughts exactly, just echo. He liked symmetry, liked the sound of taps on wood, liked the feel of rhythms that went nowhere in particular. But Nestoros lived alone, not tragically, not dramatically, just naturally. Like a spoon that had lost its matching bowl and decided it preferred soup anyway. He kept his shop tidy, always smelled of pine resin and leather, and owned exactly 3 shirts, all beige, all embroidered with a single musical note he couldn't read. Now, cobblers don't usually deal in music. Their art is rhythmical, yes, but mostly in the tap-tap of hammers and the creak of soles. But Nestoros, well, he was a little different. It started during a winter that dragged longer than it needed to. The snow melted, then froze again, then melted halfway, as if the seasons were deciding things by committee. Nestoros began taking early morning walks, just to make sure the road was still there. The fog was thick, and the silence was thicker. Too thick. It swallowed sound. His boots made no noise, and that bothered him. Not because he needed applause, but because he missed company. Even the company of his own footsteps. So, he got to work. He didn't invent the squeak. Squeaky shoes already existed, but they were accidents, embarrassments, the kind of thing people try to muffle with oil or awkward jokes. Nestoros did the opposite. He designed the squeak, carefully, intentionally, using narrow tubes of reed, small chambers carved into the heel, and a piece of cured leather so finely tuned it could mimic the note of a distant sparrow clearing its throat. He fitted the pair for himself. On the next fog walk, he stepped into the mist and heard it. Weep. Womp, weep, womp. Each foot a note, each step part of a conversation. It was silly, absolutely. But it was also soothing. The notes were simple, just 2 tones alternating, but they filled the silence like stew fills a belly. The fog didn't feel so lonely anymore. It felt like an audience. Emboldened, Nestoros expanded. He made a higher-pitched pair with a trilling squeak, perfect for skipping or for people who wanted their shoes to sound like flirty mice. Another set groaned like old doors. One pair, made for a local musician, actually played the first 4 notes of a lullaby when walking in rhythm. Soon, the whole village was tapping around in musical footwear. Nestoros created soul harmonies, a small booklet of suggested footstep rhythms for common emotions. Feeling nostalgic? Left tap, right squish, pause, repeat. Slightly hopeful, heel squeak, toe chirp, double step, sigh. Ready for soup? Just shuffle and let the shoes do the rest. Even travellers heard about the village with singing souls. A merchant from Mycenae visited, bought 3 pairs, and returned home with music in his steps and less room for logic in his heart. Of course, not everyone understood. A Stoic philosopher visited once, curious about the commotion. He left in a huff, muttering about undignified footwear, but was later spotted poking holes in his sandals near a stream to experiment with acoustic hydrology. No one said anything. Back in the village, Nestoros remained humble. He still rose before dawn, still walked in the fog. But now he brought a chorus with him. His favourite pair, a soft squeak loafer that matched the note of a kestrel circling above the olive grove. When he passed, quietly with dignity, in a pair of shoes that sighed rather than squeaked, the village honoured him the best way they knew how, by choreographing a slow, sleepy shoe dance in the square, where each person stepped only once every 4 heartbeats. They called it the Waltz of the Well-Worn Path. Even today, if you walk through certain mountain towns and your shoes let out a soft little chirp, don't be embarrassed. You're part of the symphony now. Now hush that gentle rhythm and follow me past the edge of the village, where a once grumpy oracle learned to hum prophecies to the beat of falling leaves and ended up soothing even the most impatient goats. We continue now, soft as dusk settling over mossy stone, into a sacred grove just a little off the beaten path, where even the paths seem to forget where they were going. Here, vines wrap around marble columns that never finished becoming temples, and leaves fall so slowly it's as if they're taking their time choosing where to land. This was once the home of an oracle named Megaleia. Not a famous one. Not the kind that stirred kings or made armies hesitate. Megaleia was a local oracle, the sort who specialised in small problems, misplaced combs, bad dreams, confusing fig taxes. She lived in a round hut made from clay and complaint, wore robes stitched with sarcasm, and had a voice like tea left out too long. Bitter, dry, oddly comforting. But Megaleia was, to put it gently, grumpy. Always had been. She grumbled at birds, snapped at trees, once glared at a thunderstorm until it apologised and rained somewhere else. She didn't hate people exactly, just the noise they made, especially goats. There was one in particular, a wiry, wide-eyed creature named Plaxos who belonged to the neighbouring shepherd. Plaxos had a bray like an out-of-tune panpipe and a gift for knocking over sacred incense pots with what Megaleia swore was deliberate malice. No matter how often she tried to cast him away or curse him with insomnia, he returned, always bleating as if he had urgent prophecies of his own. Then one autumn, something changed. Megaleia was sitting beneath the tallest tree in the grove trying to decipher a dream someone had had about a river turning into a snake and asking for olives. It wasn't going well. The wind was too soft to carry omens. The birds were being helpful, which was suspicious. So she sighed, and then she hummed. Not a song, not even a tune, just a low, idle hum that matched the rhythm of the falling leaves. One leaf dropped. Hum. Another drifted. Hum. A third twirled. Pause. Hum. She didn't notice at first that Plaxos had wandered up and laid down beside her, nor that he was quiet. No braying, no chewing her sleeve, just soft rhythmic breathing, his ridiculous goat eyes half-lidded like a philosopher halfway through a nap. Megaleia stopped humming, Plaxos twitched, she hummed again, he sighed, and so began the experiment. Each afternoon Megaleia sat under the tree, letting her voice follow the leaves, high when they fluttered, low when they spiraled. She didn't guide the sound, she just let it mimic the forest's breath, and each time Plaxos came, sat, slept. Word spread. Not about the goat, about the oracle. She's humming now, villagers whispered. Not chanting, someone asked. No, humming, like a bee who forgot its schedule. People began coming not for prophecies but for naps. They brought blankets, cushions. One woman brought 6 cucumbers and claimed they helped amplify dream vibrations. Megaleia didn't mind. She hummed, they napped. The wind played harmony, leaves joined in. Plaxos stood guard. She stopped writing her visions on parchment. Instead, she hummed them. If she saw a dream of someone's future bakery failing because they forgot the salt, she hummed 3 notes followed by a descending sigh. They understood. One particularly agitated olive merchant came in a flurry of anxiety, demanded a reading. Megaleia just hummed softly while flicking her fingers toward a single falling leaf. He left 2 hours later, calm as fog and unsure why he now felt peace when he thought about spoons. Scholars arrived. They asked her to write down her technique. She gave them a rock with a crack that made it whistle when the wind hit it right. One interpreted it as a metaphor for internal resonance. Another tripped over it and twisted an ankle. The lesson was unclear but widely discussed. Over time, Megaleia's reputation changed. She was still grumpy, still muttered things like, "The gods have bad timing, but her hums softened people, cooled hot tempers, cured sleeplessness, made goats behave. Even her old bones seemed to creak less." She added wind chimes to her hut, just low reeds and hollow gourds, so that even when she wasn't humming, something was. She taught the trees how to hum with her, or perhaps they'd always known. When she passed, it wasn't with ceremony or thunder, just a long, steady note drawn from her chest as she watched one final leaf drift toward her lap. Plaxos sat beside her until nightfall, and now, in that grove, if you sit very still and wait for a leaf to fall near your shoulder, you might hear a hum, not from the wind, not from memory, but from the space between, and you will understand that prophecy was never about words. It was always about rhythm. Now, leave the grove behind and follow the scent of roasted barley to a seaside cafe where a retired chorus member tried to train a parrot to sing ancient hymns and accidentally created the first feathered ambient ensemble. Let's keep floating now, gently and salt-tinged, toward a shore where waves lap like whispers and every table wobbles just slightly, just enough to make your drink ripple in rhythm with the tide. This is the edge of a coastal village so unbothered it once voted unanimously to postpone a festival because everyone felt like napping that week. The kind of place where sea foam gets names and bread is always toasted just enough to make you forgive its modest flavour. Here, tucked behind a row of sleepy fig trees, was a cafe with no sign, just a striped awning, 3 uneven stools, and a chalkboard that always said the same thing. Today's special, maybe. The cafe was run by Eutropia. She'd once been a chorus member in the grand theatres of Athens, back row, dependable alto, rarely noticed but always present. After years of singing other people's tragedies, she retired with her savings, her voice, and a parrot named Lucanicos, whom she insisted was reincarnated from a particularly dramatic playwright. Eutropia didn't miss the applause. She missed the harmony, the layers of voices blending like warm wind over tall grass. She missed the way her body knew the next note before her mind did. She missed resonance. So, she sang to her parrot. Every morning, every evening, short, gentle melodies, mostly forgotten hymns about the sea, old harvest chants, a lullaby about figs that tasted like dreams. Lucanicos listened, blinking, tilting his head, occasionally squawking what sounded like too slow, but may have just been coincidence, until one day he joined in. Not with words, but tone, pitch. Eutropia had been humming a minor hymn to Poseidon while boiling chickpeas, when Lucanicos let out a warble in the exact interval. She paused. He paused. She hummed again. He matched it. She dropped the spoon, then hugged him. Thus began their daily rehearsals. She taught him scales using raisins, call and response using bits of barley cake. Eventually she strung together enough notes for full songs. Lucanicos couldn't do lyrics, not really, but he could echo tones, he could match mood. If she sighed melodically, he'd echo with a chirpy version of regret. If she hummed hope, he trilled triumph. Customers began to notice. They'd come for the sea view, but stay for the songs. She sang softly while pouring wine. Lucanicos perched above the awning, adding his echo to the waves. It was unlike anything people had heard. Music that shimmered in mid-air and then disappeared like steam from a cracked mug. One sailor declared, "It's like my feelings grew feathers." Another muttered through tears, "I didn't know I needed a lullaby about seaweed." Eutropia didn't stop at one parrot. She rescued 2 more from a travelling merchant, Praxila and Boggy, both with questionable vocabulary and a talent for harmony. She trained them the same way, slow songs, gentle snacks, encouragement sung more than spoken. The cafe became known as the Feathered Hymn. Musicians came to study the birds, artists came to sketch them. Even an oracle stopped by and declared, "These birds are tuned to something older than Olympus." She left a feather behind that, when plucked, always made a D-flat sigh. The parrot choir expanded, not in number, just in range. Eutropia began composing new pieces, ones meant to be sung at dawn while the sea blinked open, or at dusk when the sky melted into syrup. The birds learned to time their notes with the clink of teacups, the rustle of paper menus, the creak of the stool that always leaned left. The songs weren't perfect. Sometimes Lucanicos would squawk pastry mid-lament. Sometimes Boggy would nod off during a chorus and fall beak first into the basil. But it didn't matter, because it wasn't about precision. It was about calm. One twilight, Eutropia performed a sunset hymn that had no words, just breath and rise and breath again. The parrots joined in, soft and slow. The customers, half-finished drinks in hand, forgot to clap. They just sat, and when it ended, no one moved for a long while. Eutropia leaned on the counter, Lucanicos preening his feathers in time with the waves, and smiled the kind of smile that comes from knowing something matters, even if it doesn't make headlines. When Eutropia grew too old to sing daily, she left the cafe in the care of her niece, who couldn't carry a tune but baked muffins that inspired poetry. The parrot stayed, occasionally performed. Lucanicos taught a younger bird how to trill in thirds. The music faded from daily routine to legend. But if you visit the coast and find the cafe with the awning that still sags slightly on the left and order something small and warm, you might hear it. Not loud, not insistent, just a hum, a feathered note, a sigh of song drifting out to sea. Now, sip the last of that imaginary tea and follow me down a winding trail toward a dusty village courtyard where a group of elders used cracked clay pots to drum out their dreams, one thump at a time. Let's keep moving, but slowly now, like your body sinking deeper into your blanket, limbs warm, thoughts drifting just behind your breath. Follow the narrow path away from the sea breeze, through a ribbon of olive trees, into the dustier folds of the land where the air is thicker with stories and fewer things feel like they need to be finished. We arrive at a courtyard, unremarkable to look at. Uneven stones, a few shrubs pretending to be bushes, walls of sun-bleached plaster that used to be white or maybe light brown, or perhaps just the colour of too many summers. In this courtyard, every afternoon just after lunch, but before the nap that inevitably followed it, a group of elders gathered, 6 or 7 of them, sometimes 8 if Callus the beekeeper remembered what day it was. They weren't a council or a club. They didn't solve problems, and no one ever took notes. They came to drum, with cracked pots, yes, old chipped half-forgotten amphorae, clay jugs whose handles had snapped, bowls with hairline fractures that whispered every time you poured something into them, bits of crockery too loved to throw away, but too wounded to use properly. Most people would have buried them, or tossed them down a hillside, but the elders, they turned them into instruments. It started with Theon, a retired baker whose hearing had faded but whose hand still itched to feel rhythm. One day, while waiting for his lentils to soak, he began tapping absent-mindedly on a broken lid. The sound was soft, but not dull. It had layers, a warm thud surrounded by a dry rattle, like thunder learning to tiptoe. The next day he brought the lid to the courtyard, sat on his usual stool, tapped again. After a few minutes, Horace, who once embroidered tunics so fine they made soldiers weep, joined in with a cracked basin, adding a light clink to his thump. Then came Olanos with a jar that had been used for fig preserves and now rang with a hollow wobble if you struck it just right. No one said anything. They just played. The rhythms were loose, unapologetically slow. Sometimes they matched the clinks of a spoon in someone's tea. Sometimes they followed the breeze like a tail behind a cat. Most days they played for 15, maybe 20 minutes. Just enough time for the sun to shift a little. Just enough to loosen the day from its grip. People began to listen. Not in groups, not loudly, just one by one, a child on a windowsill, a vendor taking a break from shouting about melons, a traveller stopping mid-step, lulled by the unlikely percussion. The elders called it dream drumming, because something about it, not the volume, not the beat, seemed to coax the mind into wandering, like the sound carried your thoughts out beyond the clay walls and into someplace slower. The cracked pots gave the music its signature texture. Each floor added personality. One amphora, split clean down one side, buzzed like a snoring wasp. Another, filled with small pebbles, added a lazy shake like sand in a tired maraca. They never tried to fix the cracks. That would have ruined the point. The pots weren't instruments despite their damage. They were instruments because of it. One afternoon, a visiting musician from Athens tried to join them. He brought a polished drum made of goat hide stretched tight and gleaming. He played fast, complex, beautiful. The elders listened politely, then returned to their pots. Theon offered the guest a cracked saucer. "You'll find this plays better when your thoughts are slower," he said. The musician tried, and after 3 clumsy minutes he smiled, not from success, but from forgetting he was supposed to be good at something. And so the courtyard continued. No formal concerts, no scripts, just old hands finding rhythm in fragments. Some days they played to the rhythm of rain on the tile, other days to the silence of a shared memory. Once a dog joined in, tail against the stones, a perfect backbeat. When one elder passed on, their favourite pot was placed in the centre of the courtyard, filled with thyme and soil allowed to crack further in the sun. No tears, just a new note added to the silence. The children of the village, who mostly giggled through everything, began copying the sessions. They made tiny drums from bowls and spoon handles. Some weren't cracked, yet. But they knew the trick wasn't in the pot, it was in the pause between taps. Today, if you find yourself in that village, and you will if you keep following the sleepier trails, you might come across that courtyard. Still there, still warm, still uneven. And if you stop, close your eyes and listen, you might hear it. Thump, clink, thump, buzz. Dreams being stirred one imperfect beat at a time. Now brush the dust from your sandals and follow me down a moonlit path where a stargazer once mapped constellations based on the way bread rose during baking and accidentally founded the first celestial bakery. We drift now into a place where the night sky is wider than any scroll and stars shimmer like crumbs left behind by the gods after a particularly thoughtful snack. The path beneath our feet is soft, compacted, flowery dust, worn down by quiet footsteps and the occasional napping goat. The air smells faintly of anise and charcoal and something deeper, like stories still cooling on a baking stone. We're in a small hilltop town where the sky wraps around you like a shawl, and here, at the edge of a rooftop bakery, lives a woman named Thalia. Stargazer by temperament, baker by necessity, and possibly the only person to have ever charted constellations based on the way her loaves of bread rose in the oven. Thalia wasn't known for her brilliance, not in the usual way. She burned half her batches, forgot to add salt more than once, and her idea of exact measurements was about as much as you'd carry in one hand if your hand were thinking about dinner. But she had a gift, or rather a tendency, to look up. Every evening after the fires were banked and the dough was proofing under linen cloths, Thalia would climb onto the flat roof with her flour-dusted stool, a small telescope made from a wine bottle and stubbornness, and a stack of parchment she used both for star maps and shopping lists. The townspeople chuckled at her. They called her the Celestial Loafer, which they meant as an insult, but she took as a compliment. And then, one night, somewhere between Orion's belt and the smell of cinnamon, she had an idea. Her latest loaf, left too close to the edge of the oven, had puffed into an odd shape, rounded but with 3 peaks. As she stared at it, her gaze drifted from the crust to the stars and back again. A match. Almost exactly. 3 peaks, like the points of a faint constellation above the eastern hill. Coincidence? Maybe. But Thalia didn't believe in accidents. She began experimenting, changing her proofing times, her kneading rhythms, even her daydreams while mixing. She found that if she hummed low notes while folding the dough, the bread rose with wider shoulders. If she sang in rounds, softly to herself and any passing cats, the loaves developed swirl patterns that resembled the spirals of nearby star clusters. She charted everything: the rising dough nebula, the sticky crumb of Perseus, One very flat loaf became the new moon panini. She made maps, drew diagrams, assigned names. Not the names you'd find in scholarly texts. No, these were names like grandmother's elbow or the nap star that lives behind my left eye. And people started paying attention. Not because the bread was perfect. It wasn't. It was chewy, sometimes alarmingly round. Once it exploded in the oven and they called it the crater of Apollo's regret. But it made them feel stargazed, like each bite carried a direction, a longing, a slow pull towards something warm and mysterious. Travellers heard about the bakery that sings to the sky and came not for the loaves, but to lie on Thalia's rooftop after dusk, holding crusts in their mouths while she traced flowery fingers across the heavens. She told stories, too, of a star that forgot its place and ended up in a pie, of two galaxies that fell in love but only met once every 5,000 years and shared a single raisin, of a meteor that always landed in the exact same bakery window, asking for just one roll. Thalia baked through the night and slept in the morning, her dreams full of sugar dust and moonlight. 2 days later, during a bite of walnut loaf shaped like a crescent, the sun disappeared behind a cloud in a way that startled him so much he dropped his robe. She didn't gloat. She just offered him a buttered corner and winked. By the end of the season, the town had its own starloaf calendar. Every festival had a bread. The Day of Drifting Thoughts, a long oval with a dimple in the middle. The Festival of Maybe Tomorrow, a round, puffy loaf that always split just off-centre, as if deciding to be two things at once. The quiet Thursday of naps and figs, just dough with honey barely baked, handed out in silence with a pat on the shoulder. Thalia grew older. Her hands stiffened, her notes got smudged, but her gaze stayed skyward. Even when her eyes failed, she could still feel the constellations in her crusts. She could still hear the night shift in her yeast. When she passed, the villagers made a massive loaf shaped like her telescope. They carved her star names into it and let the birds eat it piece by piece, so her map could rise into the sky one crumb at a time. And if you visit the town today, climb up that bakery roof, you'll find the stool still there and a new baker humming gently while folding dough under starlight. She doesn't follow recipes, she just listens, and sometimes the bread hums back. Now, brush the flour from your dreams and let's amble down a crooked trail where a sleepy mosaic artist once built an entire floor of lullaby tiles, each one meant to make your feet forget where they were going. Let's keep stepping, gently now, into a village where even the buildings lean slightly to the left, as if they've been listening to the same lullaby for too long. The air here smells of damp stone, lavender plaster, and the kind of slow-cooked chickpeas that take a full afternoon to remember they're supposed to be tender. And beneath it all, under one sleepy courtyard near the oldest fig tree, there lies a floor. But not just any floor, a mosaic, full, intricate, shimmering patchwork of stone and story, so quietly enchanting that people often forgot what they were doing the moment they stepped onto it. This was the work of Melaton, a mosaic artist by trade, a nap enthusiast by reputation and by temperament, somewhere between a yawning turtle and a cat who only paints when the sunlight hits just right. Melaton had been trained in the classical styles, precise shapes, heroic scenes, golden proportions, but after a few years of commissions featuring smug sea gods and overly muscular heroes, he began to lose interest. Not in the art, just in the purpose. He wanted to make something forgettable, but in the good way, something that didn't demand attention, that didn't shout, "Look at me," but instead whispered, "Hey, it's fine to stop for a while." So, he began with a single tile, a soft grey-blue piece of riverstone that he smoothed by hand until it felt like a memory. He set it slightly off-centre in the middle of a quiet courtyard, where pigeons cooed in a minor key and old people told lies about how fast they used to be. From there, he worked outward. No plan, just feeling. He chose tiles not by colour or cut, but by mood. A curved shard of terracotta that reminded him of someone forgetting what they were saying mid-sentence. A soft white sliver that looked like the echo of a cloud. A chip of sea glass that hummed just barely when tapped. He never drew it out, never made a pattern. Each morning he would bring a cup of fig leaf tea, sit cross-legged and wait for the stone to tell him where it wanted to go. And the floor grew, not in a straight line, not toward anything in particular. It curled, doubled back, paused, wandered, like the path of a very thoughtful beetle, or a story told by a grandparent who gets distracted by memories of soup. People noticed. They'd step onto the mosaic and stop. Not because it was beautiful, it was, but because they suddenly forgot what they were rushing to do. They'd blink, take a breath, feel their thoughts slow like cooled honey. Children loved it. They'd tiptoe across it, declaring that if you stepped only on the white tiles, your dreams would be funnier. Others claimed that the sea glass spots gave you better fig-picking luck. One girl swore that if you napped on the center spiral, you'd hear your future whisper through your shoes. Melaton didn't confirm or deny any of it. He just smiled, laid another tile, and yawned. Once, a noble from a nearby city commissioned him to recreate the mosaic in his villa. He sent 10 workers, a bag of gold, and a scroll with exact dimensions. Melaton sent back a note. "I cannot make the floor remember someone else's steps." The workers stayed, but ended up building a small bench near the courtyard instead. They didn't want to leave. Over time, the mosaic became known as the wandering floor. Not because it moved, but because people who walked across it tended to forget where they were going, and be glad they did. One merchant claimed that after pacing its curves for 10 minutes, he forgave a debt he'd held for 7 years. A widow remembered her favourite song. A goat herder fell asleep so deeply on the outer loop that he dreamt in full, consecutive naps, each one inside the other like pastry layers. Melaton never claimed credit. When asked what the floor meant, he'd usually mutter something like, "Oh, I just didn't feel like making straight lines that day," or "The white tiles are from a plate I broke while laughing." He continued working until he ran out of stone, or interest, no one's sure which. He left one tile space unfilled near the northeast corner. People still argue about whether it was deliberate. Some say it's a reminder that nothing needs to be finished. Others say it's where he left his final sigh. Today, if you visit, you won't find any signs, no roped-off areas. The floor is still open, still walked on, still gently confusing. And every now and then, someone will step onto it, stop mid-sentence and smile. Because they've remembered something they weren't looking for, and forgotten something they didn't need. Now, let's rise softly from the tiles and glide downhill to the banks of a lazy stream, where a miller once discovered that when he let the wheel spin too slowly, the water began to hum back in perfect lullaby tones. Come closer now, to the banks of a stream that doesn't rush, doesn't shout, doesn't even babble really, just sighs in long looping breaths like a storyteller who's forgotten the plot, but knows you'll enjoy the voice anyway. This stream was never known for its power. It couldn't move boulders, didn't shape valleys, but it had patience, and it had rhythm. The kind of rhythm that seeps into your joints and tells them, you don't need to try so hard today. Beside it stood an old mill, not grand, not important, just sturdy, leaning a little like a sleepy man trying to eavesdrop on the river's secrets. The miller's name was Corridos. He was a man of slow habits and slower conclusions, not lazy, just deliberate. He tied his apron like a ritual, ground flour as if solving a riddle, and once spent an entire morning watching a single leaf swirl in an eddy. He loved the stream, talked to it in fact. And one warm afternoon, as the clouds napped on mountaintops and the flies couldn't be bothered to buzz, Corridos noticed something unusual. The water wheel had slowed, not jammed, not broken, just drifting, like it had decided to take a longer inhale between breaths. Normally he would have gone to fix it, adjusted the flow, checked the channel, scolded it softly like a misbehaving goat. But this time, he didn't. He listened, because the wheel was humming, a low, droning note, round and soft, with the same timbre as a lullaby hummed through a scarf. The wooden paddles, catching the stream at just the right angle, were creating resonance. Not music exactly, more like a tone you could sleep inside. Corridos leaned in. The hum shifted with the current, sometimes deeper, sometimes brighter. Occasionally it hiccuped and giggled like a child in a barrel, and the water, impossibly, seemed to answer. The stream gurgled in harmony. He sat down right there, beside the wheel, and listened for hours. When the wind stirred the leaves overhead, it matched the rhythm. When the birds joined in, it felt less like a song and more like a quilt, stitched from sound and breeze and sleepiness. That night he didn't dream, because he never really woke up. He just lived in that soft edge between alert and asleep, where the mind wanders without needing a destination. The next day he didn't adjust the wheel. He let it stay slow, word spread. People came not for flour, but for naps. Caridos welcomed them with tea, a stool, and a nod toward the stream. They sat, listened, exhaled. A mother brought her colicky baby. The hum soothed them both. A baker claimed he found his new honey loaf recipe mid-listen, inspired by the tone of the wheel's third rotation. A goat lay down beside a poet and didn't get up for 3 hours. Caridos added wind chimes, not flashy ones, just hollow reeds and flat stones strung together with frayed linen. They sang along quietly, like backup singers who knew their place. Some scholars visited, curious about the acoustics. They measured angles, wrote notes, and tried to build a replica wheel in a nearby stream. It didn't work, because they forgot to slow down. One returned later and admitted, "I tried too hard." Caridos gave him a cup of warm barley water and said nothing. The humming wheel became part of the village. People planned errands around listening time. A child once wrote a bedtime story about the wheel that yawned, and her classmates acted it out during the festival of not much happening, a local holiday celebrated by doing as little as possible with great enthusiasm. When Caridos grew old, he passed the mill to his niece, a sharp-eyed girl who could still hum in the same key as the wheel and never let the paddles spin too fast. The stream still hums today. If you visit, and you mustn't rush, bring something soft to sit on. Take your shoes off. Let the hum find you. And if you fall asleep there, face tilted toward the sky, you'll wake up with flour on your elbow and no memory of what you were worried about before. Now, let the wheel spin quietly behind you and follow the faint smell of honey wax and sandalwood to a mountaintop scriptorium, where a monk with too many scrolls and not enough sleep invented a form of calligraphy so soothing it put entire libraries to sleep. Let's climb now, not in haste, but like moss, softly, slowly, with purpose that doesn't need proof. Up winding paths carved more by goat hooves and daydreams than chisels, past lavender clumps trembling in the mountain wind, toward a spire-shaped building perched so high that even the clouds ask permission before passing by. This is the scriptorium of Mount Calamos. Its walls are lined not with gold or glory, but with parchment. Thousands of scrolls, bound books, loose notes, and receipts for wine that no one remembers ordering. It smells like beeswax, leather, and ink that dreams of silence. And within it all we find Brother Epiphanios. A monk of middling height and considerable squint, he had taken a vow of patience, mostly because he had already broken all the other vows and needed something achievable. Epiphanios copied texts. That was his life. Ancient epics, new epistles, shopping lists disguised as hymns, he transcribed it all. His handwriting was famously legible, but not famous for beauty, just clarity. Until one particularly wind-heavy winter when he stopped sleeping, no drama, no tragedy, just a creeping restlessness in his thoughts. His fingers ached, not from work, but from thinking too hard about commas. He began waking in the middle of the night, wondering if he'd dotted his iotas correctly. He hadn't, but no one noticed. And then, one morning, shivering beneath 3 robes and a cloak that had once belonged to a bishop with cold knees, Epiphanios made a choice. He changed his script, not for efficiency, for comfort. Instead of tight, upright strokes, he let his letters lean, just a little, like they were resting elbows on the page. He widened the loops, let the ink breathe. Every tail curved gently, every crossbar dipped like a sigh. His margins, once strict, became meandering borders of doodles and half-formed spirals. And when he read the finished page aloud to himself, he yawned. It was the most satisfying yawn he'd ever experienced. He kept writing that way. Page after page of what he began calling somnographia, sleep writing. His fellow monks noticed. Brother Takios, known for insomnia, and lecturing about grain storage, fell asleep in the middle of one of Epiphanios' transcriptions while standing, with a scroll still open in his hands. The abbot requested a copy of the Meditations of Timocrates to help him unwind. Epiphanios delivered it in somnigraphia. The abbot slept for 16 hours. Word spread. Scholars trekked up the mountain to view the pages, not for their content. Most of it was mundane stuff about crop records and moral warnings about gossip, but for the form. The way the lines curved, the ink softened, the columns swayed like lullabies arranged in rows. One scholar called it ink that breathes. Another fell asleep with his nose in the margins and dreamed of alphabet soup singing sea shanties. Soon the scriptorium had a new wing, the quiet collection, filled entirely with Epiphanios' scripts, shelves of scrolls and books that no one could finish because they kept drifting off before the final paragraph. Became a local custom. Before bedtime, villagers would request excerpts of sleep writing. Parents copied it onto their children's pillow slips. A weaver designed a blanket whose pattern followed Epiphanios' curved lines. The result felt like being hugged by punctuation. Epiphanios never claimed credit. When asked how he developed the style, he shrugged and said, "The letters got tired, so I let them nap." He eventually stopped copying texts entirely and began composing his own. Short meditations on moss, slow bread, rainy Thursdays, and clouds that resembled grandmother's sighs, all in somnigraphia. His final manuscript was titled On the Comfort of Unfinished Thoughts. He never finished it. He didn't need to. The page ends mid-sentence, mid-curve, the ink fading out like a breath let go just before sleep. And today, in that same scriptorium, the quiet collection still hums with the drowsy peace. Scholars study it with warm mugs and drooping eyelids. One monk reads a page before every nap, swearing it makes his dreams rhyme. And if you ever find yourself tossing in bed, fingers twitching with unfinished thoughts, try writing just one sentence in curved letters. Let the lines lean, let the ink exhale, and see what happens. Now, gently close the book of thoughts and follow me into a sunlit garden where an apiarist once discovered that bees hum lullabies, not just to themselves, but to the flowers, and to any sleepy listener willing to sit still long enough. Let's settle now into a garden. No gates, no signs, just a path that narrows into softness. The kind of place that forgets its own name the moment you enter, where sunlight pours like warm syrup through fig leaves and everything is a little too fragrant to be taken seriously. In the centre of this drowsy oasis stood a modest cottage with walls made of stone, ivy and stubbornness, and within it lived a beekeeper named Irisa. Irisa didn't talk much, not because she was shy, just because the bees were better company than people who interrupted their own sentences. She had a kind of stillness to her, not frozen, not rigid, just settled, like a spoon resting on the rim of a honey jar, comfortable, ready, sticky maybe, but fine with it. Now Irisa's bees weren't like the others. They didn't swarm, didn't buzz about like tiny alarms. They hummed, softly, always in the same strange, soothing cadence, like they'd memorized a lullaby long ago and never stopped rehearsing it. It wasn't quite a tune, more like a vibration that made your shoulders drop without permission, a hum that moved through the garden like warm tea through your thoughts. Irisa first noticed it on a morning so still, even the dew forgot to evaporate. She was pruning lemon balm and absent-mindedly humming a nonsense melody she'd learned from her grandmother, a tune meant for calming sheep, not plants. But as she hummed, the bees matched her, exactly. Each note, each rise and fall. She stopped, they stopped. She hummed again. They followed. The sound wrapped around her like a shawl made of drowsy thunder, and the flowers, tulsi, thyme, soft-headed poppies, quivered, not in fear, in delight. From then on, Irisa began experimenting. She tried different tunes. Not songs, just emotional shapes. A tune that felt like a nap in a hammock. One that tasted like overripe apricots. One that made her remember the way her grandfather's hat smelled after sun and soup. The bees always responded, and more curiously, the flowers changed. Poppies opened wider. Lemon balm leaves curled inward slightly as if listening. The sleepy tune drew heavier nectar, sweeter pollen, bees lingered longer, humming back like lullaby loops on the breeze. People began to notice. A tired merchant wandered in once, chasing a runaway goat. He sat down, breathless, surrounded by hum. He fell asleep for 3 hours on a mossy rock and woke up convinced he'd just returned from a polite afterlife. Irissa said nothing. She gave him a honey biscuit and went back to trimming basil. Soon others came, not to buy honey, though they did in large sleepy amounts, but to sit, just to sit, to listen to the bees hum as it laced with Irissa's gentle melodies. One woman claimed her headache evaporated. A boy with too many thoughts stopped fidgeting. A baker began composing new recipes based on flower hum tone pairs, lavender crescendo rolls, time fade scones. One particular honey glaze was said to taste like the echo of a lullaby remembered in a dream. Irissa recorded none of this. She didn't need to. The bees remembered. When scholars arrived, of course they did, they tried to chart the frequencies. One insisted the hum was in B-flat minor, though the bees disagreed. Another claimed they had stumbled upon the acoustic empathy loop of pollinators. Irissa offered them tea. They forgot what they were arguing about. Eventually the garden gained a reputation, not a loud one, just a whispered direction. If you can't sleep, find the bees. Irissa added small benches, old tree stumps and cushions that looked like they used to be part of someone's overcoat. She made a no questions rule. If you had to ask why the bees were humming, you weren't ready. She aged gracefully. Her voice got softer, but the bees grew louder. Not obnoxiously, just confidently, as if they knew they had inherited the lullaby now. On her final day, Irissa sat in the middle of the garden, cup of tea in hand, surrounded by a low symphony of wings and petals. She hummed once, just once, then exhaled, and the bees carried the tune on. To this day, if you sit in the garden, still open, still unmarked, you'll hear it. The flowers still respond. The time still leans toward the hum. And if you're very, very quiet, you might feel it settle in your chest, the vibration of 100 tiny lullabies stitched together by wings and memory. Let that hum drift with you now, down a path toward a rocky cove where a sailor with no sense of rhythm once taught the waves to clap politely, inventing the world's first tidal lullaby orchestra. Let's drift now to the edge of the world, or at least to the part of the coast that feels like the world forgot to finish drawing it. Rocky, wild, and full of sighs. The cliffs here don't shout. They groan, slowly, like chairs you've sat in too long or thoughts you can't quite finish. There's a cove, half hidden, no name, just a mood.